Hi, everybody. This is Dana from The Dana Buckler Show. And right now, you're listening to the Journaling with PT podcast.
Welcome to the Journaling with PT podcast. I am your host, artist PT Russell. This is a podcast that highlights creative voices and emerging artists from all over the world. My very special guest today is the talented Mr. Dana Buckler. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. A few months ago, I embarked on research through the podcast sphere. My objective, to learn as much as I could about iconic actor Tony Todd and to discover new podcasts about film. The latter led me to one of the most memorable, mellifluous voices I've ever heard online. Please welcome Mr. Dana Buckler to the podcast.
Well, PT, first of all, let me say that was quite the introduction. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here to have a conversation with you. So thank you so much, and thank you for all your support. I really appreciate it.
And I have. It's been an honor, just getting to know you over this time, and thank you for bearing with me over these months in my inquisitions.
No, it's no problem whatsoever, and I appreciate. I know we were supposed to record yesterday, and I appreciate you working with me to push it 24 hours.
Oh, no worries at all. And how's the summer treating you so far?
Well, I will tell you this. I live in Florida. I live about an hour outside Tampa. So our summers, by comparison, typically start around March. And right now, it is on its way to about 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow.
And humidity that will remind you every day that you live in Florida. Now, having said all of that, I want to preface this by saying, in the wintertime, there's no place else in North America you want to be than in Florida. It is amazing. But right now, it's really that's a really long-winded answer to it's really hot outside.
Well, you're from here, I think, where I am in Canada, so you have an idea of how temperate it can be and then how kind of it can move around the weather. We're kind of mild right now.
Sure. So, I'm originally from Halifax, Nova Scotia, and I lived there until I was 15 years old. And I remember, I don't want to use the word fondly, but I certainly remember the winters up there and down here. So I've lived in the United States for a little over 30 years now.
Wow.
And I'm often asked, do you miss the snow? And my answer unequivocally is no, not at all. Like, not for a moment. I can reminisce looking at some pictures from my childhood, but that's as far as I want to go.
What about fall, though? Fall's beautiful.
Fall is beautiful, and that is the best way to describe a Florida winter. It might get a little chilly in the evenings. You might want to put a sweater on or something. And I get a little bit reminiscent about that time of year. And there's no leaves that change down here. Everything is just green and palm trees, which I know, woe is me. It's awful. I get it. But,
well, I have a lot of family in Florida. My mom's there right now in the Port St. Lucie area.
Oh, sure.
So, yeah. So it's very familiar, and it's home for me. It's a second home, actually.
Gotcha. Oh, perfect. Then you completely understand.
Totally. Which was why the change was good for me for Canada, because Florida is very similar to the Bahamas, where I'm originally from.
Okay.
So yeah, it's just like a second home. The weather, this is something totally different. The four seasons, the whole deal. So yeah, so very enjoyable. I feel differently about it. All right. It was great to have you.
Oh, thank you.
So, how do you feel about the current landscape of podcasting, actually? Do you think it's oversaturated or?
Oh, that's a great question, PT. I mean,
Mm,
I haven't even thought about that. So it's interesting if you'll indulge me for just a moment here.
sure, sure.
So I podcasting's been around since I think like 2005 in its very infant stages. I
Mm,
discovered it initially back in 2011. That's when I got my first iPhone and was just kind of playing around with the different apps. And I'm like, oh, what's a podcast?
mhm,
And quickly became enamored with them. I started my show in 2013. And what I like to say is back then, when I would tell friends and family that I was doing a podcast about movies in the film industry, they would say, "That's so cool, Dana. What's a podcast?" And I would spend more time explaining what a podcast was versus the substance of my show. And it was that way for at least 2 or 3 solid years. Now I tell people that hey, I also do a podcast. I do a podcast, and people always say, "Oh, you too." Yeah, and
mm,
so it's the number one sort of, I think, you know,
mhm,
entertainment medium out there at this point. I mean, so things changed. I want to say around 2018, 2019, when you would open up your podcast app or you'd go on YouTube and then you realize that every famous person and every celebrity out there now had a podcast.
mhm.
And it really just kind of like, whoa, this thing has really taken off. But it also buried a lot of really good independent podcasts out there. So to answer your question, do I think it's oversaturated? Absolutely, I do,
Mm,
but not by the individuals that are doing a podcast for the love of podcasting. I think it's oversaturated by the the famous people
mhm.
and the celebrities who don't really need to be doing a podcast, but it's a new stream of income for them.
That's fair.
And it must be nice to be able to sit down in a studio, record for 45 minutes, get up, walk out, and then have a whole production team handle everything else for you. So
Yeah.
that's where I would say it is, because podcasting, I think, was an independent medium that
Mm,
people like ourselves could do a show and accomplish something. Put
mhm.
our voice out there and have it. People reaching out to us. There's no greater feeling in the world than when you get an email from somebody in Australia telling you how much they love your show and to keep
Yeah,
doing what you're doing. Um,
true.
so again, and I give very long-winded answers,
No,
so
no,
I
no, that's
I apol
perfect. I love
I
it.
apologize. Yeah, but I do think it's oversaturated, but
Mm,
by people that really probably don't need to be doing a podcast.
that's very fair. So, in terms of like forecasting, what advancements do you see for the medium in the future?
Well, it's like everything else. What started out as a fun, independent way to put your voice out there has quickly been swallowed up by corporations.
Mm,
And so it's like anything out there. It's monetized, and the corporations have taken it over. And this is why some of my favorite podcasts that I listened to 10, 11, 12 years ago that are still going strong are inundated with advertisements throughout. And
mhm,
so it's it's just going to become like television and streaming and YouTube and everything like that. It's a product that people can monetize. That's where I see it coming. And
mhm,
but it is here to stay. I would say that it certainly has it's taken over radio.
mm,
I give you a perfect analogy, or a perfect example. A few years ago, back in 2017, 2018, I can remember listening to Howard Stern making fun of podcasters. Y-
shock
You know,
jock. Mhm,
yeah, he was saying that, well, what is podcasting? That's some guy in his parents' basement,
mhm,
just broadcasting, out to whoever's listening. And he was arguably making fun of the medium. He was.
mm,
Now the irony is that he still does his show every day, but excerpts of that show are put into podcast format later on in the day, and more people listen to him through his podcast than actually listen to Sirius XM radio, and he has to admit that now. So podcasting has taken over talk radio because nobody wants to get up at 6 a.m. We live in an on-demand society now. So podcasting has certainly taken over talk radio. And that is not going to change.
Mm. Beautiful. I love it. I love it. Will you take us for a ride in a DeLorean?
Yeah.
Sans Marty.
Yeah.
Back to the noisy 90s to meet
Yes.
Dana Buckler, the DJ.
Yeah. Yeah. What would you like to know?
Well, what were you playing? What songs were heaviest in the rotation?
Oh gosh. All right, let's see. So I was a big, I do not like using this term EDM. I don't like to use that
Mm,
term because that is the commercialization of dance music. But back when I was doing it, and this is like DJing with two turntables and a mixing board and playing vinyl records and playing at clubs and raves all over the United States. I was doing a lot of that. But I also had a business where I would, DJ different events. It wasn't beneath me to DJ a wedding. They paid very well. So, yeah, I mean, I would play. My true passion was dance music, but what paid the bills was, contemporary top 40 and weddings.
okay. Okay. So, any particular artists that our listeners may be listening in and maybe familiar with?
Are you referring to like sort of to the dance music
Yes, the dance
situation?
music.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. All right. So let's go back to the 90s. Let's take a trip back there. So, oh gosh.
House of
I
Pain.
listen, I'm a huge fan of the 90s. And you know that from listening to my
Yes,
podcast. So
absolutely do.
so if it was popular in the 90s, you can guarantee that I was playing it at
Okay.
different clubs. It's almost too much to sit there and think about it.
I know, I know. So, what about Hadaway? I know he was pretty big back then too.
So Hadaway was really big, and then Saturday Night Live just destroyed that
Uh-oh.
song. I feel awful because it's a great song. It
Hmm.
it it really kicks. And then of course, it gets completely just lampooned.
Yeah, so what was your experience like harnessing your creative energy in such an expressive way?
The thing is, the first time I went to a nightclub, I went there with some friends, and like most, like a group of guys would go to a nightclub, try to meet people and dance and have a good time. But I was just looking at the DJ booth. It was remember the DJ booth was sort of
Hmm.
up high,
Hmm.
and I had never heard music. I had heard some of this music, but I had never heard it through a proper club sound system before. And it when you hear the music literally go through you, you hear it completely differently. And I was watching this DJ, and I just couldn't get over how he had command of the dance floor. I said, "This is incredible." And people were just going crazy. I said, "I want to do what he's doing. I want to learn how to do that." And this is in the 90s, and I got to tell you, the first couple of years I was awful, but I was driven and I was
Right.
passionate. I was known to clear a dance floor in the first few times I went up there and started DJing. But no, for me, it was expressing myself through music. And it got to the point where you knew based on what song you would play, how the crowd would react. So you would save some really good tracks for just the right time. And there's an energy that you get from that. I mean, I'm sure it's the same thing for a
Mhm.
stand-up comedian who has got control of an audience.
Right.
There's a high there that can't be bottled, that you can't buy, and it's incredible.
That sounds like a lot of fun for sure.
Yeah.
I always enjoyed the DJs. I tried to give a tip where I could.
No, sure. That's by
uh,
the way, that's how you would get a song played.
oh yeah,
That's that's
definitely.
that's that's that was how that worked. I can tell you. And if from my back in my days, if you requested a song and a DJ said yes, that meant maybe.
Hmm.
And if the DJ said maybe, that meant no.
Oh,
So that was the verbiage we used to use back then.
wow. And how did your time as a DJ help to refine your vocal and social giftings?
Well, I will say it made me I did not have a fear of public speaking.
Okay.
And I am to this day. I mean, I did. Don't get me wrong. In the beginning, I did. I was scared to death. The first time I'm at a club and I've got to make an announcement. My hands are the microphone is in my hand and my hand is shaking. It's trembling. Scared to death. And then I make a quick announcement. This is the last song of the evening, and I take a deep breath afterwards, and I just couldn't believe it, and I got through it. And then by the time I was doing weddings, I'm in the middle of the dance floor going, all right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are. The reason we're all here today. And it just had that energy and
Hmm.
was just not afraid, like just was comfortable. And boy, did that ever translate well for me when I decided to get into podcasting because I was not afraid to get on that microphone and just start talking
And you've been going ever since. It's
ever
lovely.
since. Yeah.
So, what was your transition like from like DJ to being a DJ to working in radio?
Yeah. So that's actually, it was a pretty simple transition.
Mm.
It was a doctor telling me that you've lost probably, 50, 60% of the hearing in your right ear.
Uh-oh.
And if you keep doing this, you'll be deaf. And that is my fault. That's 100% my fault. I didn't take the necessary precautions. I could have DJ'd using earplugs. It's possible. And I just spent years in these clubs. And when you're in a DJ booth, you've got big speakers in the booth. They're called monitor speakers. It's so you can properly mix, and they're blasting in your ears all night long. And it was a simple decision. I just couldn't do it
Mm.
anymore. And so that was in 2012, I
Mm.
believe. And I was bummed out. And that was right around the time that I had discovered podcasting. And I just sort of said, well, I still want to do something creative. This podcasting thing seems pretty interesting. Let me give that a try. And that's simply how I made the transition. Now, thankfully, I still had, a lot of DJ equipment, so I had microphones and mixing boards
Mm.
so the startup costs for me were relatively low. It was just coming up with an idea on what to podcast about. And besides music, my other passion is film. And I remember listening to some movie podcasts and hearing some individuals talk about a movie I love and not agreeing with them,
Yeah.
saying, I don't agree with you. I, you know what? Let me do this myself and put at least how I feel about film out there and see if anyone responds.
Right. And how did working in radio specifically further define your stylistic choices?
I don't know how to answer that. I really don't.
Okay,
It,
that's
it
fair.
was it was
Okay.
just because I started working in radio after I did the podcast.
Mm. Okay.
So it was kind of the other way around.
Right. Okay.
So by that point, I just realized that uh, when I was working in radio, I worked for a radio station that was based out of Los Angeles, but I did it remotely because that was the world we're living in. And I just remember thinking how antiquated everything was,
Mm.
and telling them and telling the people, and I don't want to mention the radio station right now, but mentioning to them in meetings, saying, "You guys need to put this stuff in podcast format. You're not going to be around much longer," and they're not around anymore.
So it was the radio that galvanized the Dana Buckler signature?
I would think so. Okay, poss- possibly, possibly.
Okay. I just wanted to be sure about that. But podcasting, it has been elemental, at least in my evaluation, of the interplay between journalism and art and I'm really enjoying the journey immensely. What is the ethos of Dana Buckler, the podcaster?
Ask me to define that a little bit differently.
Okay, what? How do you approach your specific approach to podcasting?
Well, that's interesting.
Like for myself, like I mentioned, it's journalistic in a way,
Mm.
but I have a more expressionistic way of of my approach. It's more expressionistic in how I more abstract, like with my art, my visual art. And so everyone has a particular way that defines how they podcast. I'm
So
assuming.
yeah, yeah, no, and you're absolutely right. And the reason why I was sort of struggling to answer that question is because over that past 10 plus years, the
Mm,
show has evolved several times over.
okay.
And in the beginning, it was more dedicated film history
Mm,
and telling the stories of how movies became, you know, how movies became, how they were, what it took to make a film. And I
mm,
would do these long form stories about the creation of a particular film or a film franchise, and those things really caught on. And then I got into the interview side, and I started interviewing a lot of different filmmakers and actors and directors. And now I've gotten more into voicing my opinion on
mm,
films without making anyone feel like their opinion is wrong. And that is something that I have matured over the years. That's one thing that the podcast has taught me is
mm.
that everyone has their own opinion, and you better not tell somebody their opinion is wrong because that's you're quick to lose an audience if you do that. So I've matured over the years when it comes to my expressive thoughts on film. I'm not afraid to tell you how I feel about the current state of contemporary, theatrically released movies.
Mm.
But besides that, I've definitely gotten, you know, a little bit more. Hey, you might like that, but that's not for me.
And I've been learning so much from you is because this is my first season. And can you remember your first season or your first recorded episode?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes, I can.
What
So
was
my
that like?
so the I'll start by saying that no one's ever going to hear those first 5 or 6 episodes. They're gone. They're
Okay.
they're they're hidden away on a thumb drive somewhere, in my house. I've since taken them down. Um, I but I think back very fondly on those first few episodes that I did, like the first 10 or 12 episodes that I did, because I didn't have any structure to what my show was going to be. I just knew that I wanted to talk about movies. And I also thought it was impossible to do a podcast by yourself. I just assumed you had to have other people do a podcast with you. And so I would ask my friends, "Hey, I'm going to do a podcast about movies. Do you want to do this with me?" And they would say no. And then I learned another valuable lesson. Don't ever try to talk somebody into doing a podcast if they don't want to do it. The results are not going to be good.
Good advice.
Um, but I did get a couple friends to sit down with me. And the very first episode that we recorded was talking about Quentin Tarantino movies and then segueing into talking about the Star Wars holiday special. That makes no sense whatsoever. But at the time, it made perfect sense. And I remember I was prepared as I could be, but my other two guests weren't. And I remember during that episode, one of my other guests going, "Well, I actually haven't seen that yet," talking about the Star Wars holiday special. I said, "But you knew we were going to talk about this. Why haven't you watched it?" Like you could hear that in the episode. Um,
Oh boy.
but PT, let me tell you what I think when I think back fondly about those times. Um, it was I was working a job at the time. I worked 6 days a week. I had one day, one day to record, to edit, to produce, and release an episode. and that would take up my entire day. And I did that 10 weeks in a row passionately. And I just look back fondly on how driven I was to do this, and how now I have a little bit more free time, and it takes me a week to do an episode. I'll record on a Monday and maybe I'll get it out next Wednesday. But I was so driven back then. I remember that. Um, but I also remember no one listening to the podcast, and rightfully so. It wasn't very good. When you do a podcast for fellow podcasters out there, one thing that you are able to look at is the analytics of your show. You're able to look at, how many downloads, how many plays, where in the world people have been listening to the show. And then I was getting no numbers. The only
Uh-oh.
numbers I could account for were, the ones that my friends and family were listening to. Uh, so after 10 or 12 weeks, I remember saying to myself, uh, well, this was interesting. This was an interesting little experiment, but no one's listening to this, and I haven't got a grasp on this. So I'm just going to try something else, and hung up the headphones for a
Mm.
couple months, and just said, at least I tried. At least I can say I tried, which is more than a lot of people. People will always say, I really wish I would have done this. And, at least I could say I tried. So,
Right.
but I remember for a couple months there, it was just lingering in the back of my head that, God, I really wish that would have worked out. I really, for as bad as the show was, I still enjoyed doing that. And I was at work and I was talking to one of my coworkers, and the subject of Back to the Future came up, one of the great movies of all time.
Yes.
And a coworker was saying how much they love that movie. And I said, what's interesting about Back to the Future is that Michael J. Fox was not the first person cast as Marty McFly. And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, they wanted Michael J. Fox, but he was locked up in a contract with Family Ties, and they couldn't get him they couldn't get him. So they hired Eric Stoltz to play Marty McFly and shot like 6 weeks with Eric Stoltz. And Eric Stoltz is not a bad actor, but his comedic timing just wasn't working.
Mm.
And Robert Zemeckis, who was the director of the film, he went to Steven Spielberg, who was the producer, and said, listen, this isn't working. We're gonna have to figure this out. And Spielberg just said, all right, we'll get Michael J. Fox. And it ended up costing millions to reshoot that movie. But they did it, and the proof is in the pudding. And I remember my coworker going, that's what you should be podcasting about. You should be telling people fun stuff like that. And the light bulb went off. And then I said, you know what? You're right. And then I started it back up again and started telling film history stories. And I remember I did an episode on the movie Aliens from 1986.
Yeah.
And that episode did really well. And then one day I woke up and my downloads had 10x'd. Like, I was like, whoa, what's going on here? And I Googled my name. I Googled the podcast, which you should never do.
Okay.
But I was curious, and there's a pretty well-known website called gamesradar.com, and at least it was at the time. And their front page article was 7 movie podcasts you need to be listening to right now. And I looked, and I was number 5 on the list, and
No
couldn't
way.
believe it. Couldn't believe it.
Whoa. Oh, that's awesome, man.
And I said, I'm doing something right. And that just got the momentum going. And then it's been a heck of a journey ever since then. And then, of course, there was one other major thing that happened on my show. Very famous movie star did my podcast, and that did amazing things for the show as well.
Your podcast is off the chain, they say. I've been
Thank you.
I've been indulging, as you can tell, very excited about what's forthcoming. I've enjoyed so much of it: the interviews, the reviews, the retrospectives, and the icons. I took that on
Yeah,
most
oh, yeah.
recently, and again, speaking of segments, your icon segment, the interview with the very extremely prominent actor.
Yeah.
Do you mind sharing a little bit more about your conversation with the
Yeah.
legendary John Travolta, please?
Yeah. So let me just tell you how this all went down. Okay. So, oh, okay. So I do an episode for okay, so for the listeners out there, there's a reoccurring series on my podcast called Icons, where we look at the careers of iconic people in the industry, be it directors, actors, etc. And we had done some episodes, throughout the years, from everyone from Oliver Stone to Quentin Tarantino and Wes Craven and Michael Mann, Michael Bay, who I unabashedly love his movies, but that's a
Yes.
conversation for another
Yes.
podcast. But so we did an episode on the career of John Travolta, and when I say we, it was myself and my friend Jim Hemphill, who's he's a writer director, lives out in L.A. He also works for Quentin Tarantino at Quentin Tarantino's cinema, the New Beverly Cinema. He handles all the Q&As that happen there. So he's
I
a big
love
John.
listening to him too. Sorry to
Yeah, yeah.
interrupt,
Jim's
but
great.
I absolutely love listening to him. It's great. So
So
give him a high
Jim,
five for me.
I will, and Jim is the type of film historian that I aspire to be. Like he is. There's somebody who knows his stuff like nobody's business, and I can ask him a question and he'll just start talking, and I just get lost in what he's saying. Like the guy knows so much about everything, and he was the perfect person to ask to do these icon series with. So we're doing an episode on John Travolta now. I am 46 years old. I was 16 years old when Pulp Fiction came out. I saw it in the theater. That was one of those game changing moments in my life when it comes to cinema. And I also have two older sisters, so I grew up on a steady diet of grease as a kid in the 80s.
Of
So I
course.
well versed, in who John Travolta is or was and is. So, but I was just young enough to not understand that Travolta had sort of had this, career kind of go downward, like a downward trend in his career in the 80s. Because I was a child in the 80s and I just didn't, to me, he was always just John Travolta, the guy from Grease, the guy from Look Who's Talking, and now the guy from Pulp Fiction. Well, after Pulp Fiction, this guy goes on a 10-year run like no actor's ever had in their life.
I know.
He's getting 20 million a picture doing 3 movies a year and good movies too. So, I think it was safe to say that John Travolta is my favorite actor because I got to experience this journey he went on in real time, and it was awesome. So we do this episode on icons, and you've heard it, and
Yes.
we make the case that even in the movies that he's been doing, and this, by the way, this is 2019, so this is 5 years ago when this episode came out. But we're talking about the movies he was doing in the 2010s. And we talked about how even though those movies may not be of the highest quality, he always gives it his all. He always commits to the character. He doesn't phone a performance in. Nothing is ever a paycheck movie for him. He takes every role serious. And you can see that in the movies that he does. So so we released that episode in April of 2019. And I don't think anything of it. It's just another episode of Icons. I mean, I'm proud of it. I'm proud of the work we did, but I don't think that it's going to be this life-changing moment. I just
Mm.
release it. So, John Travolta has a house in Florida, and it's probably an hour from where I live.
Mhm.
And I had seen him once or twice in the time that I've lived in Florida. Like seen him like I'm at a restaurant, oh, John Travolta's in here. And you would see him. And it's crazy when you see somebody that famous because it's just like your brain can't process that's who that is. And
Yeah.
unlike some celebrities, he looks exactly like John Travolta in person.
Great.
So
That's good to know.
yes. So so I also worked in the restaurant industry, and in 2019 I was managing a restaurant here in Florida, and I was doing that on top of the podcast. And one night, so this is August of 2019, so several
Mhm.
months after that episode goes out, and I get a call from a buddy of mine that works at another restaurant that John Travolta is known to frequent,
Mm.
and he says, "Dana, I don't know how to tell you this, but like John Travolta sent his people into the restaurant. He he heard that you worked here, which I didn't. Um,
What?
I didn't work at that restaurant, and I say, but it is what it is. But people that at that restaurant knew who I was because. And so, long story short, he said, "Yeah, his assistants were in here trying to track you down. Apparently, John listened to your podcast, and he really wants to talk to you." And I'm like, "What's going on here?" Um, and they said they wanted your number, and I was like, "Well, did you give it to them? Did you give them the number?"
I mean, yeah.
And he's like, "Yes." And so I was like, "Okay, okay." So, um, I remember that night I was supposed to go out,
Mhm.
and it's a Saturday night, and I was like, "I'm not going anywhere." And
I
I
can
stayed up.
imagine.
Yeah, oh, yeah. So I stayed up till 4 in the morning waiting for a phone call that never came, that never happened.
Oh man.
And it was so funny because, like, during that time, I started second guessing. Well,
Mm.
why won't he call? I mean, I thought he wanted to talk to me. I thought, you start thinking about maybe he heard that one part in that episode where I said I wasn't a big fan of that particular movie. Maybe he's having second thoughts. So
Right.
the next day, I'm at my podcast studio with some buddies of mine, and we're getting ready to record. I remember specifically, we're getting ready to record an episode on the movie Rocky 3.
Mm.
And around 5:30, the phone rings, and it's a local number, but I don't recognize it. And I told everybody, "All right, everybody, shut up, shut up. This,
It's
this is
happening.
it. This is it. This is it." Everybody shuts up, and I put the phone in my ear, and I go, "Hello?" And the voice on the other end goes, "Dana?" And I go, "John?" And he goes, "No, no, this is Ron. I'm John's assistant." And I said, "Uh, well, what's going on, Ron? How you doing?" And he says, "Well, not good." I said, "Okay, tell me what's going on." He said, "Listen, we're trying to get John on his plane, but he's refusing to get on until you answer him back."
Oh
And I
wow.
said, "Answer him back? I'm sorry, Ron. I don't have anything to answer back." And he goes, "What? Hold on a second." You can hear him kind of fumbling through his phone, and he goes, "Ah, bleep. Ah, I gave him the wrong number." And I said, "Oh, okay." He goes, "Just stand by for a second." And then 2 minutes later, I get this paragraph and paragraph and paragraph text message, the
Wow.
kind that you have to scroll for like a
Oh,
good
he's a
minute to get
fast
through the whole.
texter.
Yeah, so I think he copy and pasted that message that he sent. So, but it was incredible. It said, "Hey, Dana, John Travolta here. I just
Mm.
want to tell you," and I'm going to paraphrase. "I just want to tell you that I heard your podcast episode about my career, and not since Quentin Tarantino have I heard somebody that's understood my career more than you guys. Just want to let you know that really means a lot to me." And I'm just like, I can't believe this. Like, I am just like, what is happening?
Mhm.
And I remember he goes, "I have to go, but please keep in touch." And I must have read that message, 6 or 7
I
times.
can
Just
imagine.
and my friends are like, "This is incredible." And I remember going, "That's awesome, but that's not enough. That's not enough. Not
You
enough.
want more.
I can't let this go. I can't let this opportunity go." And
Exactly.
so the next day, I'm hemming and hawing, and I just said, all he can do is say no. That's all he can do. He can just say
Mhm.
no. And if he
Yeah.
says no, he says no. He likes you. Remember, he really likes you. He compared you to Quentin Tarantino. He's going to say no. He might say yes. And so I sent this text message and I said, "Listen, John, I know you're really busy." I said, "But I
Mhm.
would love to have you join me on my podcast sometime to discuss your career a little further." 30 seconds later, "I'd love to, Dana.
My goodness.
I'll be back in September. Let's set a date up. Text me the first week of September." And so, I mean, September 1st. That's the first week of September. I didn't wait. I
How
messaged him
was your
anyway.
processing when you first heard that? I mean, like the yes.
Um, it was one of those situations where, great, he said yes. Now what?
Right.
Now
Oh,
what do you do?
oh,
Uh,
okay, okay, okay. I
eh,
feel you.
And so I remember, we set it up for September 29th. So I had a whole month. whole month
Mm,
to get this thing ready. And so I remember, feeling more confident than I probably initially thought I was gonna feel, like, because I knew his movies really, really
mm,
well.
right.
And it was one of these situations where I wasn't gonna do any kinda gotcha journalism. I wasn't gonna ask him about anything outside of his career, outside of his movies. We were gonna stick to the movies. So I felt pretty good about it. Um, I do remember discussing where we were going to do the podcast interview.
Mm,
He wanted to stick into the downtown part of Ocala, Florida. And so I had some friends that owned a restaurant there. And anyway, long story short, I got permission to use their restaurant. But I remember him saying to me, "How late can you record?" And I said,
mhm.
"Well, sure, John, you tell me." He goes, "Is 1 a.m. too late to start?" No, no, of course not.
No,
Of course not. I was like, "That's a strange time to start, but hey, whatever you want." So as we're getting about a week out, that's when the panic and anxiety starts to really kick in. That's when it's like, "Oh, this is really happening."
really
And
happened.
I'm not telling anybody because the
Mm,
last thing I want is for this to happen there to the world that, hey, arguably one of the biggest movie stars in the world is going to be on my podcast. Tune in, because if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen.
right.
So I remember about 4 days before, I really started panicking because I woke up in the middle of the night, 3 in the morning, screaming the word green room. Green room.
Oh,
He needs a green room. And for those who don't know what a green room is, it's sort of the
mm,
nickname for when you go on a talk show, any kind of talk show, be it a daytime or a late night, they have a staging area where they keep the guests in, and it's called a green room. And in that green room has whatever you want: food, drinks, anything you want. It's in there waiting for you. And so I start panicking. He needs a green room. He needs a green room. He didn't need a green room, but I thought he needed.
yeah.
And I said, "John, the night of the interview, I said, do you need anything? Steak, sushi, pasta, bourbon?"
Skittles.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You know, a, a thousand M and M's in a brandy jar. Just what do you need? And he goes, "Dana, that's very nice of you." He goes, "But honestly, if you could get me some Fiji bottled water and some unsweetened iced tea, I'll be good to go." Well,
Wow.
PT, I'm here to tell you that I
Mhm.
bought so much Fiji bottled water. I think I still have some. It's been 5 years. I still got a case in the garage. So, the only other thing I will tell you is
Mhm.
that by that point, I had a couple
Mm,
publicists that I had been communicating with back and forth about trying to secure some other guests to be on the podcast. And one of the
right.
guests that I really wanted was Peter Facinelli. And publicist emails me the middle of September and says, "Peter's available on September 29th. Will that work for you?" And I completely forgot in the moment that was the day that John was recording with me. And I said, "Yes, absolutely. Lock it down."
Oh,
So, fun fact, I actually did 2 interviews that day. I did Peter Facinelli, uh, during the afternoon, and then at 1 o'clock in the morning, I did John Travolta. Um,
what a warm up.
yeah, and Peter was great. Peter was great. He was fantastic in the show Nurse Betty. I remember him from the movie Can't Hardly Wait. A lot of people know him as Carlisle Cullen in the Twilight movies, but he's just a great guy,
Yes. Yes.
great interviewer, and
Good
somebody.
looking too.
Oh yeah, yeah, and somebody I still keep in touch with. So
Great.
stand by. He may be back on the show again
Oh, I
before
know.
the year is out. Um, Waiting for John Travolta to show up, I built a makeshift podcast studio in the private room of this restaurant. And there were backups to the backups to the backups. If I normally brought one laptop with me, I had three. I had 9 microphones. I wasn't gonna I wasn't gonna let anything prevent this from happening. And I remember the last hour before he arrived, that's when the real anxiety got to me. That's
Sweating.
that's when I was like, "I can't do this. You can't do this. You can't do this. Yeah, there's no way. Oh my God, what have you committed to? Like, what are you doing? If John
Mhm.
Travolta's about to be here and you're going to interview him, like like the self doubt, the imposter
Mhm.
syndrome
Right.
started kicking in. And then at 1 a.m., there's a knock on the door of the restaurant. I open it up, and in walks John Travolta. And he's taller than I expected him to be. I think
Yeah.
he's close to 6 foot. So he's
Okay.
so, and I remember because I'm 5'7". I'm not a very tall guy. And I remember looking up at him, and ironically, we were both wearing the same outfit. Black
Nice.
V-neck shirt with jeans and black shoes. And he looked that's the first thing he says to me. He goes, "I like your outfit." I said, "Yeah, yours too." And he gives me a hug. And he says
Sweet.
he goes, "Where are we doing this?" And I said, "Right this way." And we walked into the makeshift recording room that I set up, and there was the bottled water and the iced tea and the perfectly sliced lemons on a silver platter. Everything was there. And he grabbed the bottle of water, and he sat down, and he pulled the microphone in front of him. He goes, "All right, I'm ready whenever you are." And I didn't know how much time we were going to have. Nothing. I hadn't talked to his
Right.
agent, his publicist, his manager. There was no predetermined, you know,
Right.
by the way, no one said, "Don't ask this question." It was just him.
Right. Just winging it.
And so I didn't know how much time we were going to have. And so I hit
Mhm.
record. And, at the time, the first question, I had no notes in front of me, nothing. The only thing I had was a little piece of paper that I wrote down the name of some of his movies, where if I wanted to make sure this was a reminder to figure out a way to ask some questions about these movies. But that was it. There was no
Okay.
formal, list of questions. Ask a
Mhm.
question and let's see where the conversation goes. And we recorded for about an hour and 40 minutes. And the only reason why it didn't go longer is because I was out of gas. I was
Yeah.
exhausted. And you can hear it in my voice. When you hear
I, I
me,
I didn't hear it in your voice.
okay, good.
I heard that episode twice, and
Okay.
I don't. You can't tell.
Okay, well, at the end when I go, "Listen, John, thanks for doing this." Like, I have nothing left. I'm hanging on by a thread. And then the irony is that when we're done recording and I'm like starting to pack up the equipment, and picture me like, wrapping up the cables and the wires, and he's still just talking, and we're just talking. And before you know it, it's 6 o'clock in the morning and we're still just
And
talking.
just talking and hanging out with John
Hang
Travolta.
Yeah, yeah. And so that
Amazing.
you know, we would have done more podcasts. We would have done more together. This was, 2019, and then early 2020, the world changed. And so, but we kept in touch via, cell phone texting and things like that. And then he did my show in December of last year.
The
Uh,
Shepherd, yes.
the Shepherd. Yeah.
That
And
was
that,
really good. I enjoyed that.
well, thank you. And what was great about that was he reached out to me again. "Hey, Dana, can I come on the podcast? I've got a new short film on Disney Plus I'd like to talk about." Sure,
Goodness.
absolutely.
Dana
Um,
the man.
yeah, listen, and so um, I can tell you this, that so I've had this friendship with him for going on about almost 5 years, and it's really cool to be able to just reach out to him, especially if I'm watching one of his movies with some friends. It's a fun, I like to say, it's a fun little parlor trick I like to pull. Like if we're watching Face Off with some friends, and then I'll
That's one of my favorites.
yeah, exactly. And then
That
he'll
is
ask
one of my favorites.
somebody,
Yeah.
be like, "I wonder what John was doing in this scene." "Well, let's ask him real quick." And I'll just
Oh
text
my
him, "Hey,
goodness.
John, listen, in Face Off, that the first time that you realize that you're Castor Troy and blah blah blah," and he'll answer me back, and it's awesome. So
Yeah, that's a blessing.
yeah,
That is a blessing to have that, and just you didn't have any gatekeepers to get by or anything like
no,
that.
no, and that is unfortunately, that is something that most people in the podcasting sphere will have to deal with when trying to get somebody famous on their show. And I'm no exception to the rule. With the exception of John Travolta, I have talked to more publicists and managers than I care to ever talk to again. Um, Managers are great. Publicists are a little more like I'm convinced half the time they don't even let their client know that there is a request to do a podcast interview, but that's just my personal feeling.
Yeah, that could be right. Navigating, for me, navigating interviews is something new. Uh, I've been blessed in that I'm just learning along the way, not overwhelmed by my guests that I've had, and I'm happy about that because I am growing. But yeah, it's what are your key maxims? I mean, like dealing with uh, interviewing guests.
Well, I'll put it this way. For me, I'm not gonna ask anyone to do my show if I'm not genuinely interested in what they do.
Okay.
So I won't do an interview just for the sake of an interview. If I'm asking you to be on my show, it's because I genuinely am fascinated by what you do. And so if I'm fascinated by what you do, then I pretty much know who you are. So I'm excited to, to just dive right in. Um, that's the first thing that I will say. So I've turned down interviews, from people, because I'm just like, well, that's, it's cool what they do, but it's not something that I'm really interested
Mhm.
in. So that's one thing. But when it comes to the actual interview, uh, you know, uh, I like the gentleman you had on your show a couple weeks ago,
Okay.
Bob. I can never pronounce his last
Signs.
name.
Signs.
Signs. That was an awesome interview.
Okay.
I listened to that whole thing,
Glad you like
and that
it.
oh yeah, and he was very interesting. But I just like just the way you started off that show.
Okay.
Tell
Thank
us a little
you.
bit
I
about it.
appreciate
Yeah,
that so much.
yeah. And it made me look into some of his films, and I was like, oh, I need to watch that. That's gonna be. And he was a fascinating guest, by the way. Just want to let you know,
I
just
appreciate that.
fascinating.
And I'll definitely let him know.
Yeah, very, very engaging, and
Mm,
you did a great job on that interview.
yeah.
So, I think the most important thing that I can bestow upon anyone what you're going to do an interview with is know as much as you can about the person you're going to be talking about or
Mhm.
talking to.
Okay.
Ask a question and let them answer it, and then organically go from there. I did a couple interviews where I had pre-prepared questions,
Okay.
and I found that the flow of that episode seemed robotic for me, at least for me.
Okay.
Now I make it a point to write down a couple keywords when I do an interview where it's like, okay, make sure at some point you touch on this, make sure at some point you touch on this, but just take the conversation wherever it goes.
Mhm. Okay.
That's my process. It's different for everybody, but that's my process. At least that's what how it was for John Travolta. I wrote down name a few of his movies and just said,
But
okay,
you know his stuff inside out though,
I
Dana.
did, I did.
So yeah, that's different. What advice would you give for creatives, any creatives listening, who may be intimidated by the medium of podcasting?
The best advice that I could give somebody if they're going to do a podcast, and I don't even think that like intimidating, like, but the best advice that I could give is ask yourself this question: would you be a fan of the podcast you're creating?
Mhm.
And if the answer is yes, then just keep doing it. And if the answer is no, rethink the whole process, because you got to love what you're doing. You got to love the idea for your show. And trust me, there's enough people out there on this planet that others will love it as well. But make sure that you are a fan of what you do first and foremost. That's the best advice I could give.
That's great advice. It's absolutely great advice, and we're about to wrap up. And I appreciated this so much. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness.
I'm sorry for the really long-winded answers.
No,
I,
that
I,
this is
I
it's
have to be
super.
reeled in from time to time. I
No,
apologize.
it's absolutely perfect. I know exactly what I was getting, so it's fine. Okay, I wanted to revisit the King of Cool again, right?
Okay.
Mr. John Travolta, and share
Sure.
my top three films.
Please.
And they include John Woo's kinetic classic of Face Off, of course,
Yes.
uh,
Yes.
Grease,
Yeah.
and well, Urban Cowboy, and a very utterly understated White Man's Burden fall into number three for me. I
Yeah.
want to know your top three
Oh
JT films.
gosh. Okay. Well, can I comment on the three that you just listed there
Absolutely.
first? So, White Man's Burden with
Mm-hmm.
Harry Belafonte, and
Mm-hmm.
of course John Travolta.
Yes.
It's an incredibly interesting premise for a film,
Mm-hmm.
and I've seen it a couple times. But the reason I bring it up is, interestingly, it's a movie that he made before Pulp Fiction that
Mm-hmm.
sat on the shelf for about a year, and then after Pulp Fiction, they released it.
Oh, okay.
But I have seen that movie a couple of times, and I think it's an incredible movie, and it's like you said, understated, underrated. I don't think a
Yes.
lot of
Swept
individuals
under the
would
rug, and I'm not sure
yeah,
why. Some
yeah,
people consider it like very controversial because they're saying, well, one of the arguments is that okay, here it is where we have the race divide, right? And
yeah,
they're showing their perspective of how they think things should be. And so that's been the argument that I've heard. But for
yeah.
me, it's a piece of art that I enjoy, and the performances are great. And I'm not sure why it's been shelved in a
It
way.
it asks it asks the question, what if Pulp Fiction had never happened?
Hmm.
Because this movie was made before Pulp Fiction. It was done. All right. Where does that movie even get released? Like, I don't know. I mean, of course, it gets released on home video, but does it even get a theatrical release? I'm not sure, but I agree with you. I
Hmm.
think the performances are outstanding. I think Travolta is really good, and now,
Would you mind coming back on so we can do like a deep dive into it?
yeah, of course, I would love to.
Okay,
Absolutely.
perfect.
Okay. All right. Now, Grease is the word. I mean,
Yes,
what are
it
you gonna say?
is.
Like
Okay.
it's look, it's such a fun movie. I think it's a little bit more edgy than a lot of people remember. There are a lot of themes in that movie, that, like, I did, a screening of Grease back in 2018. I think it was a 40-year anniversary, or I hosted a screening of it, and there were a lot of parents that brought very young children to the movie, probably, 7, 8, 9-year-olds, and I remember watching it with this going, there's some pretty heavy subject matter in for kids. I don't know if people remember this or not. And I think some of the parents were like, "Oh gosh," because we remember the music,
Right.
but it's actually a really good movie. And I had the opportunity to interview the director, of that film,
Did
uh,
you?
back
Wow.
in 2016, and I had to pass because I had something else going on, and I regret that immensely.
Mm,
That's one of my big
goodness.
regrets.
Okay.
And then, of course, Face Off is, I mean, look, what do you
That's
say about it? It's
okay.
Look, that is a big budget R-rated movie for adults with the most ridiculous premise ever, and it
Love
made a
it.
ton of money, and it's so much fun.
It
And
is.
it's just, again, PT, there's an example of a movie will never get made today. It won't happen.
Why'd you say
It
that?
Okay, no studio, and we could do a whole episode on the current state of contemporary cinema. That
Okay.
no studio is gonna spend $200 million on an R-rated movie that teenagers can't get into, because they have to those movies have to make $1 billion for them to even be profitable.
Mm,
They're just not gonna do it. It just won't happen anymore.
mm,
Now, could you make that same movie for 30 million with half the stunts? Yeah, yeah, you could, but they won't.
mm.
So it's amazing, and there's a lot of chatter that there's a sequel in the works.
Yeah, I saw something on Twitter.
I've spoken to John about that, and
Oh, okay,
I
from the
can't.
horse's mouth, right?
No, no, I listen. I can't confirm or
You can't
deny anything.
confirm. Yeah,
Can't
okay.
confirm or deny anything. But there's definitely, what I can say is there's definitely some interest in bringing those two actors back together. But
now I'm very curious as to how it's going to be done, right? Because Castor Troy is supposed to be
exactly,
finished.
exactly, exactly. But hey, listen, everything is a sequel, prequel, and remake this day, so they'll figure out a way.
I know, like de aging and all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Um,
Now you asked me about my favorite Travolta
yes,
performances.
your top
Okay.
three.
Oh, geez, that is tough. All right, it could change. So, Chili Palmer in
Okay.
Get Shorty, I think is probably my favorite cool John Travolta. Like, just he's so cool and confident and just oozes charisma. So
Wow.
that is in the discussion. Um, it's such a difficult movie to watch. Saturday Night Fever is a movie I don't think has aged very well. But
Mm,
there's it's just a very difficult movie to watch. I was watching it the other day and I'm like, this is such a heavy film, but he is
mhm.
so good in that movie.
Yeah.
He is so good in that film. And I'm sorry, but I know the disco music has come and gone, but when he does his solo dance on the
Yes.
floor, when his
Mm,
brother is there for the
mm,
first time and sees him dance for the first time,
yeah.
that's incredible. Absolutely incredible. Here's a fun fact about Saturday Night Fever. That movie was so popular when it came out. It
Hmm.
was so popular that the studio it's a very hard R-rated movie. I mean, it is really there is some tough stuff in that movie. The studio said, "I know what we'll do. Let's recut the movie into a PG version of the film, re-release it in theaters so now kids can go see it." And they did it. I've never heard of that before in my life.
Yeah.
A movie is so popular, they said, "Let's take all the edgy material out and re-release it in theaters," and they did. Um, I love John Travolta as a bad guy, so Face Off is probably up
Okay.
there.
There you go.
Absolutely. He is diabolical in The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3. I think he's incredible in that film. Yeah, PT, it's g
I know.
I can
Yeah.
make a case for all of his movies.
Yes. And
Urban
really,
Cowboy, he's
yes.
great in Urban Cowboy.
Broken Arrow. I mean, on
Broken
and
Arrow.
on.
I watched Broken Arrow about 2 weeks ago. I hadn't seen that in a few years.
And
That's
So Sweet and Phenomenon.
yeah, oh, yeah, and then Great and Michael, like, here we go. We could just
Everything we could go on and on.
yeah, yeah.
And I loved your review of Fanatic. That was really good too. I watched it a couple times.
Yeah, so Fanatic is,
Mhm.
I think it's a much better movie than I mean, obviously, it was lambasted by the critics. They,
Mhm.
I thought it was really, really good. I thought it was interesting. And then I got to have Devin Sawa on the show because of that.
Wow.
And
Wow.
Devin was really, really cool. And so that movie has a special place in my heart. Fred Durst actually directed that movie.
Okay.
And I thought for a moment there he was going to do my show because John actually asked him. John reached
Okay.
out to him and said, "Will you do my friend Dana's podcast to
My
talk
friend
about?"
Dana.
I know to do my friend Dana's podcast because that's how I got Devin Sawa on the show. John
Oh,
reached out to Devin, and then one day I got a text message from Devin Sawa. "Hey, this is Devin. John told me I should do your show. Let's do it." And
that's
then
great.
he did the same thing with Fred Durst, and Fred Durst wrote back as, "Nah, I don't really want to talk
He
about
was
that movie
great in
anymore."
Fanatic, by
Yeah.
the way.
Oh, Devin
And
Sawa? Yeah.
yes, 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 he was.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, John was, and even his mannerisms. I wasn't 100% sure if he was supposed to be on the spectrum or not because I have a son on the spectrum,
Yeah.
and I noticed that there were some ticks that were very similar. So his physicality was on point, is what I'm saying. I'm not 100% sure if he was, just what the issue was with his character, with John's character. But yeah, some of the ticks and his mannerisms were spot on. That's all I
Yeah,
wanted to say
and
about that.
it's never overtly said, if
Hmm.
there's
Right.
I think I think it's heavily implied, like you just said.
Hmm. Yeah.
And what I found fascinating about The Fanatic was how, uh, repeatedly your
Hmm.
empathy towards Moose, the character Moose,
Yes.
would change. You would go from
That's
feeling
true.
very,
Yeah.
very sorry for him to being like, "This guy's crazy." And then you'd feel that way about Devon Sawa's character, Hunter, the same way. At first, you're like, you're on his side, and then you're like, oh, buddy, hey, listen, take it easy. So there's this roller coaster of ups and downs about how you
Mm.
feel about these characters. And that's what I thought was really fascinating about the film. And I think a lot of people missed that,
Yes,
at least the critics with their reviews, because they were so quickly to be like, this is the worst performance John Travolta's ever given, where I disagree. I
I
think it was one of
disagree
the
as well.
better ones, one of the better ones.
Yes.
So that's
And I'm
great.
just speaking because I said, again, to reiterate, his mannerisms, I have a son on the spectrum. There's a lot of
Yeah.
similarities. And I was like, wow, it wasn't stated, but I was like, this looks very familiar. It's an awesome job that he did in
Yeah.
that film. Yeah.
I agree. I agree.
All right. I mean, this has been great. I can talk to you all day,
Yeah.
but yeah. So thank you so much for sharing space with us, Dana.
Oh, thank you for having me. This was great. I just hope I didn't talk too much,
Oh no, you
but I
were
do.
perfect, and exactly, and that's exactly what I wanted you to do. You did.
Awesome.
You rose to the occasion perfectly.
Awesome.
May everything you touch continue to be blessed.
Well, I appreciate. Thank you, and same to you. And thank you. Keep on with your journey. I've been really enjoying. I've just been getting into listening to all of your interviews, and the more I was listening to, the more I was like, I can't wait to do this show.
Well, I appreciate that very much. I'm learning and growing, and your show is really helped me and is helping me along the way.
Well, thank you. That means everything to me. So thank you so much.
Before you go, though, where can folks find you?
Yeah. So the podcast is available pretty much wherever podcasts are found. Yeah, that's Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google. Well, I guess Google is now YouTube. So just anywhere you find your favorite podcast, that's where you can find the Dana Buckler Show. And if you want to follow me on social media, I'm on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Dana Buckler Show, and I'm on Instagram at the Dana Buckler. So feel free to follow me, reach out to me, and let's have a conversation.
Right there. Thank you for listening to the Journaling with PT podcast and my conversation with Mr. Dana Buckler. His information is in the show notes. Give him a follow. Check him out. Listen to the podcast. It is amazing. And please subscribe here. Continue to follow us. Continue to support. We appreciate you so very much, each and every one of you, dear listeners. So thank you again. Check out ptrussell.com. Stay tuned to that. There's one more entry before season 1 ends, and it's been glorious, to say the least. Thank you again for joining me on this ride. Take good care of yourself.